All right, welcome back to part two. So, last we left off on ethics and Christian living. So now we're going to move into pastoral advice. So when we read Paul, we also see that um, we have what are called the pastoral epistles, and these refer to three letters in the New Testament. They are First and Second Timothy, and then Titus. And these letters are called pastoral because they are addressed to individuals, specifically Timothy and Titus, who were early Christian leaders serving in pastoral or ministry roles. And excuse me, I get like the burps or something, so I constantly stop. So if you hear me I know it's too much information, but guess what? It is what it is, and you all know how I am, so whatever. So they're in ministry or pastoral roles. The content of these letters includes instructions and advice on matters related to the pastoral care and the leadership of Christian communities. Okay. Then we also have the theme of resurrection and eschatology. Paul's letters contain significant teachings on the resurrection of the dead and the hope of future glory. And mind you, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection where the Sadducees did not. So, of course, he's going to talk about the resurrection and how great it is. Um, this, of course, is not the resurrection of Jesus, but the resurrection of the dead, right? Us, once we die, the people who have died before us. That is, we get a new body. We come, right? There's a thing where we're kind of asleep and then we get called up, if you will. He does this specifically in 1 Corinthians 15 and in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Those are really like end time-ish, where he expands on the resurrection of the body, proclaiming the victory over death through Christ's resurrection and anticipating the future resurrection of believers. Then we move into the theme of Christological emphases, right? Throughout his letters, Paul places a strong emphasis on the person and work of Jesus Christ. Christology is simply the study of Christ. Uh, is a This is a prominent theme that we've already mentioned that, right? I mean, it's huge, right? Christ, Jesus, this is Jesus. Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah, right? Messiah, Hebrew Christ, Christos, Greek. And so he is what we would consider the chosen one. And so he kind of just puts a huge emphasis on that, right? He explores incarnation, the crucifixion, resurrection, and exaltation of Jesus, that is, his ascent, as central themes to the Christian faith. And then finally, one of the other major themes that we talk about, and like I said, we only touched on, this is number 8, right? Themes of Paul. He's got quite a few. So number 8 for us here, which is a really big umbrella one, is Paul's challenge to imperial authority, right? This is one of my favorites. I love this. But some scholars argue that certain elements in Paul's writings can be seen as challenging the authority of the empire. Indirectly, of course, by the use of his words like Lord to identify Jesus or Savior, um, King of Kings, all those titles, right? Prince of Peace, all those titles that he uses for Jesus are indirectly aimed at the empire. And that's because when it comes to the empire, we're going to dive into this a little bit more later, but Caesar is considered the King of Kings. He is considered the Prince of Peace, right? The Savior of the world. All these titles are actually already being used to talk about Caesar. And so now Paul's using them inadvertently to talk about Jesus. And so it's kind of a dig at empire. These theologians would say, I like it, but I like confrontation, so I kind of side with this idea a little bit. It's at least fun to deal with. And then the best case for this, of course, comes from the letter of Philippians in the language of citizens of heaven. It's not citizens of this world. So, yeah, those are some of the big themes we have in Paul. Now, let's dive into authorship. Oh, I guess I forgot to click the slide again. That's going to happen when I do the online thing. I just don't really pay attention too much. Well, we went over it. There you go. Christology. I'm not sure if you need to know that one, but just write it down just in case. Christology equals the study of Christ. All right, so let's dive into authorship. What did Paul write? And are we sure he wrote these letters? Well, as stated earlier, Paul wrote 13 letters that are contained in the New Testament. However, his work is split into two categories: the undisputed letters of Paul and the disputed letters of Paul. So, diving into it, right, I made a nice fancy list for all y'all right here. So, the undisputed letters, everyone's kind of like, yeah, we know Paul wrote it. And here's some of the funny thing. I know some of y'all wrote this in your reflections this past week, that I believe Paul wrote every single letter. Okay. Well, we kind of already talked about it. Key one, number one, Romans. We know Paul did not physically write Romans, right? But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about writing. So in this sense, we're talking about, did Paul have somebody write this down that he was saying? Did he write it down? Did he check it? Like, we know that the words that are being used in these letters come from Paul. So the first one, Romans. Second and third, First and Second Corinthians. Fourth, Galatians. Fifth, Philippians. Sixth, First Thessalonians. Seven, Philemon. And then we have the disputed letters. Mind you, disputed in the sense that, did Paul write them, or did a disciple of Paul's, or somebody who followed Paul, who really liked Paul, who knew Paul really in and out, right, in the sense of his philosophy, theology, and all that, write in his name? And remember, we talked about how this was a common practice in that day. So the disputed letters come down to quite a bit of different things, which we'll talk about here in a second, but let's go over the disputed letters. So disputed letters are Ephesians, Colossians, Second Thessalonians, First and Second Timothy, and Titus. And you got to catch those last three, right? Those are the pastoral letters. Interestingly, all three of them land on the disputed letters list. So, as I mentioned, this was a common practice, right? Could have been someone, could have been a student of Paul's. So what are some of these key descriptors then of why we would consider some letters being authored by him and others not? So here we go. And I think you're going to need to know the three factors. So the bolded portions of this slide and the next slide. And I'll remind you of that. So know these three things. What are the three key factors of the disputed letters of Paul, or some type of wording like that? Here they are: style and vocabulary, right? So scholars analyze the linguistic and stylistic differences between the undisputed and disputed letters to determine whether the latter exhibit features are inconsistent with Paul's known writings. That is, if you wrote a letter, or if you all the homework. Okay, here you go. Great example. When you're writing for school, professors can really get to know you and how you write, your form, the words you used, your rhythm, everything, right? I can almost pick out your papers without having a name on it. Sometimes I can't because, well, sometimes you guys use this generic like setup, and then it's hard for me to figure it out. But once I start reading the meat and bones, I can really figure out who wrote it. And so when somebody then uses like Chat GPT or some form of AI to write a paper and turns it in, a professor can usually be like, "Wow, what? They didn't write this." Or if you copy and paste from a friend, maybe they might go, "Wait, this sounds familiar," or "This style is not like this person," and I know for a fact they don't know that word. Um, then we kind of dive into, did you actually write it? The same sense, that's what they did for Paul. They're like, well, the thing that's being talked about here, did he really write it? It doesn't match up with what we know he wrote. So they look into all that, right? Then you have the historical context and theological themes. So consideration of the historical context and the development of certain theological concepts over time may have impacted conclusions about authorship. That is to say, the historical situations and theological themes being discussed in the letters are believed to have taken place after Paul's death. So, for instance, Paul might be talking about a historical thing that took place, but we know that historical thing. I don't have an example for you off the top of my head. Um, didn't happen until after his death. We can say, well, how would he know that? Right? That doesn't make sense. Maybe he didn't write that, or maybe he didn't write that portion. That is to say, let's see. Oh, here we go. Look at this. I got an example for you. An example that shows these two factors at work comes from Second Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, which reads like an over-realized eschatology. That is, the authors are telling the community, don't listen to anyone else, for we have this inside information, right? And we are the only ones that know what happens or what matters at the end times. In Second Thessalonians, the author talks about this person, this lawless one, coming to cause chaos and assert himself as God. Yet in the undisputed letters, when Paul talks about the second coming or the eschaton, end times, right? He only talks about Christ coming back or the resurrection of the dead. He doesn't ever talk about this evildoer, if you will. So it's interesting that in Second Thessalonians, Second Thessalonians, that Paul then now is describing this evil person that's going to come to power and do certain things. When in the undisputed letters, anytime he talks about the end times, he never brings that up. He only kind of focuses on the positive, right? That Christ is coming back, that the resurrection of the dead is going to happen, and that we're going to be, if you will, in a sense, happy. So this is kind of downer Paul. So where did this come from? Scholars would say. Now, I'm not telling you that that's what it is. I'm just giving you the 411 on what scholars do and what they think. So the style, vocabulary, and theological themes then in this section or this example seems odd and kind of off to what Paul would usually write and how he writes his letters. Not to mention that the situation in Second Thessalonians seems different than the first, that is First Thessalonians, and the same goes for the overall response of, that is Paul writing the letter. So, as we mentioned before, right, we believe that some of the writings that take place have pseudonymous writings. Pseudonymous writing. Which means false name or a text written in another name. I think we've already done this, but make sure you need to know this one as well. What is pseudonymous? It means false name or a text written in another name. While the practice of writing in the name of another person seems odd to us today, this was common practice in the first century, as I mentioned before. This was one way followers of a person would try to extend the influence of their important teacher. When this happened, the author's goal was to apply the teachings and ideas of the person they are claiming to be and apply them to a new situation or context, right? Many of you even write about, we kind of agree with Ains that the Bible should be kind of interpreted in a way that we can understand today in 2024. Well, that's kind of what they were doing, right? They were taking famous people, philosophers, and then writing for their time and situations that were taking place and applying their philosophy. So in this sense, they would be applying Paul's theology. One prime example that we have that is outside the Bible during this period is people were still writing letters during this time, right, of Paul. They were still writing letters in the name of Socrates, which is 300 years after his death. We still have letters being that are stated as being written from Socrates. So this was not considered dishonest. I mean, for us today, it seems really odd. And nor were they trying to fool anybody. But people understood, because this was super common, that it was more about expanding the tradition or teachings to then be applied to this new time, this new era, or to the new situation, right? Although although some of Paul's letters are disputed, this does not make them any less important, right? Just because we figure out and say 100% of the fact we figure out someday that Paul did not write Second Thessalonians. Does that mean we have to get rid of it? No, it does not, because it doesn't make it any less important. These letters still speak truth and utilize the overarching gospel message of Jesus and Paul's theology, right? So we don't have to throw them out. And I think too many people hang up on that, right? If we can prove one thing wrong, then the whole house falls apart. That's not the case. And as I mentioned before, right, we also got to talk about how when we read a letter, these are one half of a conversation. When we read Paul's letters or any of the New Testament letters for that fact, we should think of them as one half of a conversation. For instance, have you ever tried to listen in on a person's phone call? Do you know how hard it is? How hard it can be to make sense of the whole conversation? This is because you are only hearing the response the person in front of you is giving, and you have no idea what the other person on the other end may be asking or trying to discuss. And maybe you kind of get a general idea because of the responses, but we're not getting the details, right? The best you can do is use clues to form a judgment that then allows us to come to a conclusion. So we must remember that Paul wrote his letters to specific communities or individuals to address various theological, ethical, and pastoral concerns. The recipient, in turn, formed the other half of the conversation as they received, read, and responded to Paul's letters. In several letters, Paul refers to previous correspondences, right? So we read some of these letters and it's like, in my previous letter, and sometimes, and a lot of times, we don't have that previous letter. For instance, when it comes to First and Second Corinthians, we believe that there's a 3 and 4 Corinthians. We believe that First Corinthians is actually Second Corinthians, and Second Corinthians is actually, I believe, Fourth Corinthians. We feel like we're missing something there. I'd have to dig into that one again. But yeah, we feel like we're missing 2 letters, or that even one of those letters was partially found and then squeezed into one of the other ones. So yeah, a lot happening, right? So this suggests an ongoing exchange of information and concerns between Paul and the Christian communities, yet we do not have these letters to fully piece together everything that's happening. All right, I already said that. So that's all I have for this lecture, which was really the remainder of the last lecture. So we're going to sign off here, and you had everything about Paul, and then we're going to dive into Paul's letters next. And let's see, so I'll make sure I'm going to click here, and you might get a sneak peek. Bam, yep, there's your sneak peek. So we're going to dive into that. You know what? We'll just dive into it now. Yeah, and then we'll create another lecture here in a second to finish this lecture off. So lecture number 3, we're diving into the letters now. Or no, you know what? We're going to break it. And let's make it, because if you want to take a break, it's a good time to take a break. All right, you've been sitting here for like 45 minutes. All right, so let me stop this.